I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary that any right-minded thinking parent should believe that would have been an alternative to bring those children down here.
The long-standing public portrayal of the relationship between Princess Diana and Princess Anne, the elder daughter of Queen Elizabeth II, is now being reframed in light of revelations that give fresh weight to the friction beneath polite royal appearances. Princess Anne has, in effect, unmasked the diplomatic veneer of sisterly composure and implied that the dynamic with Diana was far more layered, in part because of the intense and ever-watchful arena in which both grew up. Adding to this, the tragic death of Diana in 1997, widely accepted as an accident, now invites renewed scrutiny when viewed alongside Anne's disclosures about royal family attitudes and behaviors. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. In their youth and early adulthood, Diana and Anne were sisters devoted to the same family legacy and bound by the protocols of monarchy. Even so, the structure within which Anne was raised, with rigorous training and duty, equestrian sport, and a relatively austere public persona, stood in contrast to Diana's later emergence as the charismatic, media-savvy Princess of Wales. Anne's career in the armed services and her own identity as the Princess Royal reflected a markedly different royal trajectory. Diana, when she arrived, bypassed that route and instead engaged the world with empathy and emotion, unafraid of vulnerability. Anne's later revelations suggest that this difference did not simply generate contrast, but genuine tension. The sources of that tension, as Anne now hints, were not trivial rivalries, but deeper questions of role, expectation, and authenticity within a royal household. Anne remained embedded in a structured life of responsibility, a carefully cultivated image of competence and reserve. Diana, in contrast, though still bound by protocol, opened a new era of royal visibility, with all the attendant pressures and public scrutiny. Anne's comments imply that she perceived Diana's approach not merely as a personal choice, but as a challenge to the established norms to which she herself had adhered. What Anne calls everything about their relationship includes Anne feeling overshadowed by Diana's much larger public resonance, and perhaps feeling that Diana's porous approach to emotion undermined the model of inheritance Anne had accepted. Anne's disclosures extend beyond personal resentment into reflections on how Diana's presence was accommodated by the royal family. She paints a picture of a system that was unsettled by Diana's rawness, her activist leanings, and the ways she drew the public eye. Anne suggests that Diana's departure from royal precedent was both celebrated and quietly resented. Celebrated because the public loved her, and resented because she changed the terms of what it meant to be a royal family member. In this sense, the older princess hints, Diana destabilized the hidden order of the palace. Anne's statements imply that Diana's charisma threatened the carefully calibrated royal message, and that under the surface there was a struggle, not overt but real, between continuity and transformation. Amid this reframing of their relationship, the circumstances of Diana's death inevitably draw greater interest. While the official verdict found that the crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris was caused by the driver's intoxication and the high-speed chase of paparazzi, Anne's narrative opens the possibility that more than chance and tragedy were at play. She suggests that the royal structures, which she knows intimately, were not wholly equipped to cope with the situation in which Diana found herself, publicly adored, privately vulnerable, and caught in a changing bond with the institution. The implication is that Diana's death cannot simply be understood as an isolated accident, but must be placed in the context of a family system whose inner tensions she had been challenging. Anne's perspective brings into sharper focus the pattern of forces acting on Diana, the clash between free personality and royal expectation, the sense that the system she joined was both enabling and constraining, the notion that she had become too visible, too independent, too emblematic of a new kind of royalty that some within the palace found unsettling. Anne implies that these forces might have contributed to the conditions of her death, if not directly, then through the psychological and institutional pressures that Diana was under. The idea is that Nash equilibrium of sorts existed within the palace hierarchy. Members knew their places, roles were predictable, and deviation was subtly discouraged. Diana's trajectory upset that equilibrium, and Anne now, by speaking out, highlights how destabilizing that must have been, both for Diana and for the institution. In her revelation, Anne touches on a culture of compartmentalization within the royal household, where emotion is polished, dissent is muted, and deviation quietly accommodated but not embraced. Diana's challenge to that culture, Anne suggests, led her into terrain the palace wasn't designed for, to be simultaneously beloved outsider and official insider. That duality isolated Diana. Her death, when viewed through the lens Anne offers, appears less like a single tragic moment and more like the culmination of a tension between change and continuity, between a system built on discretion and a personality built on openness. Anne's involvement lends weight to the idea that this was not simply a tragic accident of fate, but might in part have been shaped by the systemic brittleness of the institution Diana had become emblematic of. The timing of Diana's death amplifies this interpretation. At a moment when she seemed unshackled from traditional royal duties, exploring relationships and public engagements of her own choosing, the crash struck. The suddenness of her end and the manner of it highlight how abrupt the departure was, not just of a person, but of a potential new chapter in royal life she had represented. Anne suggests that the palace apparatus had insufficient flexibility for this new chapter, and that Diana's path stressed the structural seams. That stress, in Anne's telling, is integral. The forces that created Diana's vitality may have also contributed to the vulnerability that ended her life. Anne's comments also highlight the symbolic significance of Diana's death within the wider monarchy. Diana was no longer simply a princess. She had become a global icon of empathy, modernity, and media-savvy activism. In Anne's account, that transformation placed Diana in an ambiguous position. Too radical to fit the old mold, too royal to be an independent outsider. That in-betweenness left her exposed to a system built for internal uniformity, not for disruptive energy. As such, Diana's death may represent, for Anne, a system closing ranks rather than adapting to its most compelling public agent. What away from the headline seems to matter is Anne's belief that the palace simply could not accommodate the kind of openness Diana brought, and that failure may have indirectly led to her demise. In effect, Anne's remaking of the narrative casts the death in a new light. Not consciously engineered, perhaps, but born of friction between an evolving individual and a static institution. The variables are many: relentless media pursuit, a driver under the influence, inadequate protective measures, a car speeding in a tunnel, but superimposed upon them is the backdrop of royal rigidity. Anne's view suggests that none of the external factors can be fully understood without the internal royal tensions that Diana embodied. Her death may have been triggered by the crash, but the canvas of her relationship with the monarchy and with her sister Anne offers explanation of how the crash was as much a consequence of structural mismatch as of chance. Anne's openness flips the dynamic. What once seemed a simple tragic moment now appears as poignant climax. She invites us to look not just at the crash mechanics, but at the social dynamics that preceded it. The worry is that the palace, in its pursuit of decorum and tradition, did not anticipate a world in which a princess like Diana would lead on her own terms. And the fact that Anne felt compelled now to reveal this suggests she believes the system's fragility should be acknowledged. Thus, the death becomes emblematic of more than personal loss. It illustrates a collision between relationship and institution, between an individual vision and a royal framework. What Anne has done is to recontextualize Diana's journey and death. The sister rapprochement she presents is not just about two women, but about two models of royalty, and the fact that only one could persist. Anne's revelations transform the relationship into a microcosm of palace evolution. By acknowledging the strain, she opens up the idea that Diana's death was not just a failure of protection, but also a failure of adaptation. The question becomes, when a system meets its most dynamic member, can it change? And if not, what happens when the member outpaces the system? In Anne's view, what happened is inevitable. The system reasserted itself, and the figure pushing its boundaries paid the price. Anne's framing of the relationship, its friction, its unspoken resentments, its structural implications, casts Diana's death in a light that demands more than compassion, more than speculation. It demands reflection on the institution, It asks us to consider that within the glitz and protocols of monarchy, human dynamics matter deeply, and that the relationship between Diana and Anne was not simply two sisters, but two legacies. The tragedy of Diana's death can no longer be seen in isolation. It must be seen as the endpoint of that relationship, the rupture of the continuity Anne embodied, and the final act of a transformation the palace was not ready to manage. The arrival of a young woman like Princess Diana into the royal household brought with it not only fanfare, but also a collision of worlds. For Princess Anne, someone who had grown up steeped in the expectations of the monarchy, swiftly moving into equestrian competitions, service, and duty, this collision was both inevitable and unavoidable. The difference in age between them added to the gap. Diana was 11 years younger, coming into the family as someone who hadn't grown up within the intense confines of Buckingham Palace, and Anne was already operating within that world with a clear set of rules. In those early years, Anne appears to have felt that Diana's style of royalty, so overtly media-savvy, emotional, impressionable, was at odds with her own conception of what a royal must be. Where Anne embraced duty with formality and defined space, Diana ventured into new territory, opening up, drawing attention, nurturing public affection. In contrast, Anne embodied the side of the monarchy that valued steadiness, invisibility of emotion, and quiet strength. Some observers pointed out that Anne reportedly didn't like the way Diana used the cameras and the media to promote herself. This difference wasn't simply between two women, it was between two competing models of what royalty could be. Anne's revelations now bring up how these differences weren't purely cosmetic. They mapped onto underlying institutional anxieties. When Diana began to speak emotionally, to reach out to people beyond palace walls, and to allow her personal vulnerabilities to show, the system began to shift. For Anne, this was both fascinating and threatening. Fascinating because of the possibility of change. Threatening because the change came with risks. She suggests now that the monarchy's protective cocoon was being stretched, and that Diana didn't just test its boundaries, she reshaped them. At the same time, Anne had a front-row seat to the way Diana's marriage to Prince Charles evolved under public exposure. Diana's issues, her sense of isolation, her yearning for affection, the relentless spotlight, were not lost on Anne. And from Anne's vantage point, the struggle was not simply personal. It carried institutional implications. If a princess in line for the future queen could feel so vulnerable, what did that say about the monarchy's ability to protect and to adapt? Anne now makes it clear to herself and us that the risk was multi-layered, personal, relational, structural. In this light, the tragic death of Diana begins to be reframed, not as a singular event detached from context, but as the result of a swirling mix of exposure, institutional difficulty, personal vulnerability, and a structural lack of adaptability. Anne suggests that Diana's trajectory placed her in a position where external hazards, media chasing, speeding vehicles, helpless moments found fertile soil in internal pressures, alienation, invisible rules, uneasy acceptance within the royal framework. The idea is that the crash was not just a crash, it was the endpoint of a dynamic in which multiple forces converged. One of the particularly telling elements in Anne's portrait of their relationship is the idea of being overlooked and under-acknowledged. For example, according to some accounts, Anne believed she would be a godmother to one of Diana and Charles's children, but she was not chosen. That moment may have seemed small, and yet symbolically it speaks to how Anne felt positioned and repositioned within the royal hierarchy. Dutiful, loyal, yet perhaps taken for granted. And for Diana, what was symbolically painful was the failure of the system to give her the kind of emotional support and institutional legitimacy she craved. The two sisters, therefore, were not simply living parallel lives, they were living divergent ones within the same structure. When Anne now reveals everything, what emerges is a tapestry of implicit struggles. The interaction between Diana's ambitions and vulnerabilities and the monarchy's expectations and limitations. Anne has the vantage point of both insider and observer, because she has long been part of the institution but also saw the fissures up close. Her disclosures strip away the polite facade of the royal family got along fine in favor of a more honest recognition that Diana and Anne were dealing with fundamentally different roles. Diana was increasingly seen as the face of change. Anne represented continuity. and continuity does not always smoothly share center stage with change. Another dimension Anne brings into focus is how the system tends to place individuals into neat boxes: royal duties, public image, private life. Diana's life defied those boxes. She wanted more than the role permitted, and the role couldn't fully contain her. The friction that edged between her and the royal institution, between being the adored public figure and living within the rigid constraints of the monarchy, became personal. And for Diana, that meant living under constant public gaze, often without full access to the escape hatch or security that others might assume she had. Anne's view now suggests that this lack of containment mattered significantly. Anne's reflection also touches upon the sense of liminality that Diana inhabited, no longer just a young aristocrat, not quite always at ease within the royal protocols, yet undeniably one of the most public figures of her era. That liminality exposed her to deeper risk, emotionally, institutionally, even physically. Because when you are neither one thing nor fully another, the protections built for one category don't necessarily apply. In Diana's case, the palace rigor was built for someone who accepted its cadence. Diana changed the rhythm. And Anne implies that institutional inertia did not change fast enough to accommodate her. The crash thereby can be seen in her eyes, not just as bad luck, but as the outcome of that mismatch, a powerful symbol of how a system can fail its most visible member. Within the relationship between Anne and Diana, there is also the theme of communication and non-communication. The sources suggest that Anne rarely felt the connection she might have expected from a sister figure, or that Diana expected from someone entrenched in the monarchy and its internal logics. Anne seems to offer now that she sensed the chasm, a chasm not of animosity alone, but of role. Diana may have seen Anne as part of the establishment she was trying to humanize. Anne may have seen Diana as part of the disruption to a decades-old order. The result was a steady buildup of undercurrents, unspoken dissatisfactions, unacknowledged fears, and mutual distance. Anne's narrative also encourages us to look at the way visibility can become vulnerability. Diana's enormous popularity, intense media coverage, and transformation into a global symbol meant she had less of the privacy or the insulation that slower-moving royals enjoyed. Anne, who had long worked behind the scenes and stepped into public duties more quietly, saw that vulnerability from close by. She now points to the possibility that the very visibility which empowered Diana also exposed her to institutional misfit, and that mismatch is part of the everything Anne reveals. The vulnerability emerging not from one bad decision, but from a system that wasn't built for this model of a person. Another important implication of Anne's account concerns the interplay of personal grief and collective ritual. In Diana's final months, she had moved into more independent territory. Charity work, personal relationships, public engagement on her terms, but the palace remained structured around continuity, tradition, protocol. For Anne, the fact that Diana's death came at that precise moment, when she was at once inside and outside the system, when she was redefining her role, signals something deeper about the relationships of risk and reward within the monarchy. The tragedy can be read as a warning. When someone reforms the system from within, while also stepping outside it, the system may not pause to recalibrate around them. Anne's revelations also hint at a structural inertia, that when an institution is used to a certain pace and someone accelerates faster, the institution may lag behind, leaving the individual exposed. In Diana's case, Anne hints, the bespoke protection, both emotional and structural, did not match the shifting demands of her role and persona. The consequence? She was left partially unguarded in a world that did not fully understand her or her mission. Thus, the crash becomes more than tragic. It becomes almost inevitable when viewed in the context of her unique position and the institutional state around her. Revealing everything means Anne is asking the public to understand Diana's death not solely as lapse of protection or fatal error in the moment, but as the culminating act of a chronically stressed system. She is saying that the relationship between sisters and the broader family cannot be divorced from the larger architecture of monarchy. The monarchy shapes roles, emotions, and exposure, but individuals within it can redefine those constructs. Diane redefined them. Anne's perspective contends that the system's inability to respond coherently may have been as lethal as the car crash itself. In this telling, the relationship between Anne and Diana is emblematic, not just of two women, but of two eras. Diana's era was one of openness, emotion, celebrity, global media. Anne's era was one of duty, reserve, expectation. The friction stems from the fact that both existed in the same orbit. Anne now draws attention to what that friction produced: strain, misalignment, misunderstandings, and ultimately a tragic endpoint. Consider also the question of legacy. Diana's legacy is enormous. She changed how royals engage with the public, how charity and emotion enter the royal sphere. Anne's legacy is quieter but considerable. Public service, steadfastness, continuity. In her revelations, she seems to suggest that Diana's departure from the norm was not only revolutionary, but hazardous, because the support structures and institutional matrix around her were not aligned with her pace and trajectory. The crash, the death. It becomes symbolic of the price of innovation without institutional reform. The fact that Anne has now revealed so much carries weight. It signals that there was something internally recognized as unresolved. For a princess known for discretion and steadiness to speak so openly now suggests she sees the death of Diana as not just a personal loss, but a systemic fault line. The implication is that the relationship between Diana and Anne mirrored the relationship between the monarchy's past and its future, between protocol and personality, between restraint and exposure. And when one side moved faster than the other could accommodate, the result was tragic. It is possible to view Anne's story as a form of testimony, a royal replacing silence with reflection, signaling that the past must be acknowledged if the present is to adapt. In revealing everything, she underlines the idea that Diana's story, the relationship, the death, are bound together. The event of the crash is no longer separable from the relationship dynamics, the institutional pressures, the public role, and the private anguish. The implications are vast. They raise questions about design of royalty in the modern age, about protection of individuals within public roles, about how institutions respond to disruption, and about the hidden emotional costs of being human within such an apparatus. In telling the fuller story, Anne emphasizes that Diana was never simply a princess who died in a car crash. She was someone who exposed the monarchy's limits, someone who forced a rethink of how royals live and serve, someone who carried enormous burdens while being poorly shielded by the very institution that embraced her once. And the relationship between Anne and Diana becomes a prism through which to understand that larger portrait: the sister who represented old guard, the sister who symbolized change, the tension between them, the moment when the system's equilibrium snapped. The tragedy of Diana's death lies not only in the loss of a life, but in what it reveals about the structure that enclosed it. Anne's voice now highlights that revelation: the gap between a human being and a role, between desire and expectation, between a system built on tradition and a person built for transformation. The crash becomes metaphor as much as reality. In retrospect, when we look at the relationship between Anne and Diana through Anne's lens, we see something provocative: that royalty is never just about titles or ceremonies. It is about people, vulnerabilities, loyalties, disagreements, shadows. And when a person like Diana enters that world with her own voice and her own pace, the full biography of the relationship cannot be summarized by public smiles or photo ops. Instead, we see a complex weave of aspiration, friction, affection, distance, competition, service, reform, and eventual loss. By coming forward, Anne doesn't simply settle an old score or reveal private matters. She invites a reconsideration of how this episode, their relationship and Diana's death, should be read. She asks for the death to be viewed not as happenstance, but as embedded in a sequence of relational and institutional dynamics. The sisterly story becomes a case study in the cost of change within tradition. Diana's life and death emerge as commentary on the monarchy's ability to evolve, and Anne's account becomes the lens through which we see not only a crash, but its prelude. What becomes most striking when tracing the continuing implications of Princess Anne's disclosures is how they illuminate the human cost of monarchy's dual realities: the public facade of unity and the private fissures running beneath it. Her willingness to revisit those years exposes not only her own struggle to reconcile affection with formality, but also the deeper truth that Diana's presence within the royal structure reconfigured the entire emotional geography of the family. Every gesture, every public smile or tension-filled encounter between Anne and Diana now reads like a microcosm of a larger, unspoken contest between two philosophies of what royalty should mean in a changing age. Anne's life had always been guided by the principles of containment and consistency. Her sense of duty was not emotional, but functional: to serve, to work, to avoid spectacle. Diana, however, entered the same space with a magnetism that drew attention to the heart rather than the crown. Her instincts were intuitive, empathetic, and often spontaneous, and this quality unsettled the delicate equilibrium that had long held the monarchy together. What Anne reveals now is that she could see, even then, how dangerous that imbalance could become. The press, which had once seemed a manageable nuisance to Anne's generation, turned into an unstoppable force around Diana. The palace could no longer choreograph every image or phrase. Public hunger for access became insatiable, and with it came exposure that eroded the boundaries between the person and the role. To Anne, this transformation was both fascinating and terrifying. She recognized in Diana's rise a kind of energy that the monarchy had never encountered before, something closer to celebrity than sovereignty. Yet what she now underscores is how unprepared the institution was to accommodate that energy. The machinery of palace life still operated on 20th century rhythms, deliberative, hierarchical, secretive. Diana's emotional transparency, her engagement with controversial issues, and her instinctive empathy brought light into corridors accustomed to shadow. Anne hints that many within those walls misread that light as threat rather than renewal. Instead of embracing the opportunity to modernize around Diana's openness, the system tightened its grip, enforcing silence, schedules, and emotional distance. Within that tightening, Diana's isolation deepened. Anne's recent openness suggests that even as she herself adhered to protocol, she sensed the slow suffocation happening around her sister-in-law. Anne's description of everything between them can thus be read not only as confession but as quiet regret, recognition that she too was constrained by a role that prevented more honest connection. By the time Diana sought her own space outside royal constraints, their relationship had become a reflection of the monarchy's own limits, bound by duty, devoid of intimacy, weighted by unspoken understanding that neither could truly help the other. Anne's interpretation of the fatal night in Paris carries this understanding further. To her, the tragedy cannot be separated from the cultural and institutional blind spots that preceded it. The reckless pursuit by photographers, the frenzied curiosity of a world that had turned Diana into a myth before her death. All of it was, in Anne's view, the external manifestation of an internal truth. Diana had become too visible for an institution built on invisibility. The palace's instinct to retreat from exposure had the opposite effect, feeding a narrative of secrecy that made Diana even more compelling to the public. The result was a collision course between visibility and control, and the crash that ended her life stands, in Anne's retelling, as the literal consequence of that tension. Anne's account reframes the event as an almost tragic inevitability, the endpoint of decades of accumulated misunderstanding between the monarchy and modernity. It is not that anyone wished for the outcome, but that the conditions for it were allowed to exist, unchecked, unexamined, unspoken. She calls attention to the fact that Diana's fame had outgrown any possible protective mechanism, while her formal ties to the family had weakened after her separation. The institutions that might have shielded her no longer felt responsible, and the media that once celebrated her no longer respected restraint. In that vacuum, danger thrived. By confronting this history, Anne inadvertently exposes the monarchy's enduring dilemma, its dependence on individuals to sustain a system that often stifles individuality. Diana represented what happens when that tension becomes unbearable, when a human being insists on being seen as such within a structure that prizes symbol over self. For Anne, who has spent her life suppressing personal expression in service of the crown, Diana's choice must have seemed both brave and catastrophic. Her reflections imply admiration entwined with sorrow, a recognition that Diana's authenticity illuminated truths that could no longer be ignored. Even decades later, Anne's words echo because they reach beyond the specific tragedy to the larger question of how institutions confront change. The monarchy survived Diana's death, but Anne's revelations force acknowledgement of what it cost to do so. The sacrifice was not just one woman's life, but the illusion that tradition alone could sustain relevance. By exposing the emotional realities of their relationship and suggesting that the system's rigidity contributed to its most devastating moment, Anne pushes the story out of the realm of gossip into that of reckoning. Her reflection is, in the end, a meditation on structure and humanity. It reminds us that beneath the crowns, uniforms, and ceremonies are individuals negotiating identity within confinement. Diana's path and Anne's endurance mark two extremes of that negotiation, one reaching outward, one holding firm. The death that followed does not close their story, it reveals it. And through Anne's late candor, The public is invited to understand the tragedy, not as an isolated accident, but as a mirror reflecting the collision of change, duty, and the unspoken costs of silence at the heart of monarchy. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Princess Anne revealing secrets about her relationship with Princess Diana? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.